Hello, my friends. Brian King here. I read an article this morning that talked about something that I see a lot with the clients I work with over the years, especially the ADHD clients. And, come to think of it, a lot of the Asperger's clients too. So I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to discuss it so that you are more familiar with what this phenomenon is called, and also that you understand that it's not just you, that happens to many of us, and give you some ideas on what to do about it, okay? So I see people starting to tune in. Hey there, Liz. Thank you for joining. The phenomenon I'm talking about is something referred to as emotional flooding. You familiar with that term at all? Maybe, maybe not. It's something that you pretty much have to be introduced, has to be introduced to you the term-wise. But what emotional flooding typically is when somebody with ADHD or Asperger's seems to be overcome by emotions, even at the drop of a hat. So much so that they can't think straight. Now, does that sound familiar? Does that sound like something that you've either observed in yourself or other people that either have Asperger's or have ADHD? I remember when I was younger, I would burst into tears at the slightest criticism. I would become furious, at the slightest disrespect. And some people kind of explain this as the 0 to 60 phenomenon. It's like this child was calm a few minutes ago, then suddenly they were angry or they were panicking or something. A lot of that is the result of emotional flooding, and this is why it happens. Typically, people have a pretty solid working memory, which is also kind of synonymous with short-term memory, meaning they can hold a lot of information in their mind about the situation, what's happening around them, the plans they have for how to engage that situation. Yeah, Jesse, I suspected that that might have sounded familiar to you. So people tend to have a pretty good capacity in their short-term memory. They can hold a lot of information, especially in a classroom setting. The teacher is throwing all of this lecture stuff at you, putting stuff on the whiteboard or the overhead, making a list on the board, and you can follow this just fine, unless you have a very short supply of working memory, like a lot of us with ADHD or Asperger's do, which means we can only handle maybe 1 or 2 bits of information at a time. Any more than that, and we zone out, we forget about it, and it's just a no-go unless you're writing things down for us. Now, what are the implications as far as emotion? Emotion is part of what allows us to assess the environment. You have thoughts about the situation, maybe you have an emotional response, and then you're able to take that emotion into account when making a decision about what kind of action you're going to take. You with me so far? But let's say there's only a little bit of working memory. Well, you can't store all the thoughts, you can't store all the emotion, and you can't make a plan to act because there's so little room. And emotion can be so intense that it floods your working memory and pushes all the thinking out. Now what you have is somebody that is experiencing raw emotion. They seem completely irrational. You can't talk to them, and you can't calm them down. Why is that? Because there's all emotion and very little thinking. And this happens a lot with our kiddos. I'm sure a lot of you have light bulbs going off right now saying, oh my God, that's what's happening. It makes perfect sense now. Think of it this way. Let's say there is a river that's going, this is the bridge, okay? River's going underneath, fine, smooth sailing, right? But now let's say a bunch of stuff has clogged the bridge. A bunch of logs and stuff have gathered. So now the water can't get under the bridge anymore. Now it rises. The pressure builds. And all of a sudden, it's flooding over the bridge. That's what happens with emotional flooding. There's very little room under the bridge. So when the emotion starts coming at a more rapid pace, it can't go under. It can only go over. It can only flood. And that's one of the unfortunate aspects of ADHD or Asperger's. So what do you do about it? Are you forever going to be a victim of this? The answer is no. Because like I mentioned, thoughts occur before emotions, okay? And that's when you're choosing your response. Because one thing we know about our kiddos that have the ADHD and the the Asperger's, is you can build up a whole library full of reactivity. This belief that the world is coming at you, that you have to protect yourself at all times, that problems shouldn't happen, threats shouldn't happen, everything should be easy. And if something goes slightly wrong, boom, you react. You don't even think. It just kind of happens. That's why I specialize in helping people unlearn reactivity, because so much of what we learn to do is in reaction to the constant criticism, the correction, all the stuff that's been piled on us for our entire lives pretty much, because we are different, inappropriate. You with me? So the way we can correct emotional flooding is to regain your capacity to choose your response, so that you can see a situation and choose whether it's going to be, oh my goodness, this is terrible, this is a catastrophe, or, well, this is inconvenient, and I know I've handled this in the past successfully, and I know I have plans to handle it successfully now. When you can approach a situation proactively, the emotional flood does not occur. Does this make sense? Emotional flooding occurs in the presence of reactivity. When you believe, you're kind of walking around on alert constantly because you believe the world is a threatening place, then you're sitting there kind of on the edge. There's already stuff under the bridge. There's this anticipation anxiety. There's this fretting. There's this worry that's already reducing the capacity of your working memory. Then all it needs is proof. One thing to happen to validate the worry or the paranoia or the anxiety that you have, then all of a sudden, boom, the flood happens, the bridge is flooded, and you're overwhelmed. That's how emotional flooding takes place. And like I said, there's a very specific remedy to it. You must unlearn the reactivity that feeds the flood. And when you can do that, you not only take more control of your emotions, you take back control of your life. And what a profound difference would that make for you? Pretty amazing, right? Yeah, Phoebe, you're not alone. Like I said at the beginning, this is so much of us. When I was, even into my early 20s, I lost one of the best girlfriends I ever had because of my rages. It did not take much to get me so overloaded, something wasn't going right, and it wasn't the way I planned, and I would start yelling. I never got physical, never, ever, ever. But man, would I yell. Well, after one too many times of scaring the crap out of her, she decided to dump me, and I can't blame her. That was all on me that I blew that relationship. But it was also a wake-up call that, man, I need to do something about this. And now we're talking 20-some years later, I'm teaching people all over the world how to do this because I've so immersed myself in it. It's that important to me. And I imagine for those of you that are afraid to go out in the world for many reasons because you're afraid you'll be overwhelmed. You're afraid it will be too emotional. So if this tendency in you has become a barrier between you and the rest of the world, let's do something about it. Like I said, the remedies are there. I can teach you how to do this stuff. You don't need to be a victim to emotional flooding. You deserve and you are capable of being in charge of your emotions and being in charge of your life. I don't know how familiar some of you are with my story, but I was my own worst enemy as a kid. Severe anxiety issues. I would miss weeks of school every single year with just my anxiety, with my fretting. And like I said about my girlfriend, angry rages, get into serious depression the moment something wouldn't go my way. My emotions were beating the snot out of me. And it wasn't until I found myself pretty much alone, no friends to be had, that I realized, well, if I'm not surrounded by people, who can I blame for my situation? There's nobody engaging. So that's when I realized, it's probably me. And I began committing my life to doing the work I needed to not only master myself, my relationships, but my life. And that's what I teach. And I'm sure many of you that are tuned in here have seen my videos over the year or however many months I've been doing this and see that I practice what I preach, that I know my stuff with incredible detail, down to the smallest thing, because I'm not into being pretty good at something. I want to master it or I don't want to do it. And when it comes to relationships, this is something that I used to be so terrible at. I would piss somebody off just by opening my mouth, and I didn't mean to. People were constantly offended by things I said. And I had no idea what I was doing wrong. But I committed myself to figuring it out. And I've become so successful that people around the world have sought me out to teach them how to improve their relationships. How cool is that? So, Jesse, you said you try to tell your husband this. You get easily overwhelmed about stuff and have learned how to calm down when the flooding happens. That's awesome. We struggled for a minute because he wouldn't allow me to use the skills I learned, but you got over it. That's the key right there. And you can share this with him so that he can get a little bit more context and put some language to it. That'll probably help him be even more compassionate to you and be able to support you in that. So, hopefully this has been helpful to you guys. By the comments I'm seeing, it has been. So I'm grateful that I shared this with you because I want it to be helpful. And I'm sure, based on, again, some of these comments, there are plenty of people in your life that could benefit from this understanding of themselves. So feel free to share and share and share. And remember, I'm always here for you. We're in this together, folks. So have an amazing day. This is Brian, and we will talk again soon.